Oh, and also we'll be recording the session, so if you would like to keep your cameras off, feel free to do so. Okay. So welcome everyone. Today we'll be doing an introduction to trauma-informed community care. So we'll be dissecting and talking about what is trauma and what is community care and how to put those two together to support each other. And let's go to the next slide. So before we go on, I just want to mention that while we are recording, but we will pause the recording for group discussions because we want to keep the stories. If anyone shares any stories or experiences, we want to keep that among our group. And I also want to say that if you're watching this video as a recording, not during this session, I encourage you to watch it with community, with someone else who you could talk to about this information afterwards, who you trust. And if you find any of the content that I will be talking about triggering, I encourage you to stop the recording and take care of yourself. So that could look like reaching out to a friend, to a colleague, going for a walk, just doing something to soothe yourself. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, my email is there as well. And let's go to the next session. And also before we get into all the information, I wanted to share some resources at UBC. The resources are imperfect and don't work for everyone, but if you are looking for resources on campus, I've provided some links. We can also post them into the chat at the end of the session. The first link is especially helpful because it's a way to see all the different resources in one space to choose the one that's right for you. Yeah, we'll post the links at the end of the session as well. Let's go into the next slide. So this is our outline. We've already done a check-in. Next, we'll talk about some expectations and boundaries for the session. Then we'll get into what is trauma and how is it linked to oppression. And we'll talk about trauma responses, the window of tolerance and triggers. And we'll do a short activity. Hopefully we'll have time for that. Next, we'll talk about why it's important to address trauma and scholar activist work. And after that, we'll talk about how we can address trauma and scholar activist work. Yeah, and then we'll do a checkout. Now we can go to the next slide. And just before we get into talking about trauma, also wanted to mention why we are talking about this topic to you guys. More or less, yeah. So I think that this topic has some relevance for this project because of one of your deliverables is to look at key Canadian cases where the safety and security of the scholarly community was at risk. So if you are looking at scholars who are at risk, who are experiencing trauma, it is possible that you might experience secondary trauma as well. So that's why this is important to talk about. I think it's also important to talk about outside of this project because even outside of this project, trauma is very common and most people experience trauma at some point in their lives. So we want to help build a skill set and an awareness around trauma so that we can learn some strategies to cope and heal. And overall, we want to build resilience so that we can engage in activism sustainably over long periods of time and take care of one another. Okay, we can go into the next slide. And these are some of the expectations and boundaries that I will ask you all to follow during this meeting because we're talking about a sensitive subject. So the priority is really your safety and well-being. So while I'm really passionate and I want to talk about these topics, I want to prioritize everyone's well-being and everyone's safety. So if you find something triggering, feel free to leave the meeting, to take a break, to go for a walk, to reach out to one of us, to talk about it. So please listen to your body, and if you're feeling unwell, feel free. I mean, not feel free, but please take care of yourself. The second expectation is bodies will be bodies. So related to the first expectation, please listen to how your body's feeling, how you're feeling, and trust how you're feeling and respect that. The next expectation is that we want to create a safe space, a brave space to have these discussions. So that entails engaging in respectful dialogue, having empathy for one another, practicing active listening. The next expectation is that if someone chooses to share personal stories, let's keep that among our group. So the stories stay, but lessons can leave. If it's not your story and you don't have the consent of someone to share it, please don't share it. The next expectation is give space, make space. So which relates to the other expectation about awareness of power dynamics and positionalities, because we want to be aware of the space we take up. I'll be talking a lot during this presentation, to be honest, but I will make space for discussion as well. And the last expectation is difference between intention and impact. So during these discussions, we want to be aware of the impact that we're having. And if we have a negative impact, we want to own up to it and be honest about it and not gaslight anyone. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So this is the approach that I've been taking throughout this presentation to trauma-informed community care. I'm using a humanizing and holistic lens that looks at how we can support the whole person, including our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being. I'm using an intersectional lens, which is a framework from Kimberly Crenshaw that is used to understand how different aspects of a person's identity, such as gender, race, class, sexuality, age, ability, etc., combine to create various discriminations and privileges within our current power structures. I'm also using an anti-oppressive framework, which involves making visible, denormalizing, and challenging oppressive systems of power. And finally, I'm using a trauma and healing informed framework by talking about trauma and its holistic impacts on people, and talking about some holistic healing practices that we can do as well. Okay, we can go into the next slide. So next I will try to define what trauma is and trauma responses, and we'll look at the window of tolerance and do a quick activity about it. And we can go into the next slide. So what is trauma? It's very difficult to define because it's a subjective experience, so there is no one correct definition. This is one that I'll be using. I define trauma as a normal reaction to a harmful or threatful and overwhelming experience that impacts someone's functioning and holistic, including physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being. Trauma is very common, and as I said, most individuals encounter it. The difference between trauma and stress is that after this experience is over, your body remembers it and continues to relive it. So you If you experience trauma, you might get triggered by certain things that you weren't triggered by before, and your body would react as if you are in danger and would go into fight, flight, freeze, or frown response, which I will talk more about later. And also wanted to touch on about how trauma is not an event, but is an experience. So what is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another, which is why it's so hard to define. It's a subjective experience. And we can go on to the next slide. So trauma is also not an individual experience. It's connected to systemic oppression, and the environment that a person is in really matters, because the environment can set up conditions for trauma to occur. And also what happens after the experience is really important. So for example, an important mitigating factor is who is there for you when the trauma occurs. If you have a community of people who supports you and is there for you, cares for you, the event might not be as traumatic to you. So for example, if you're a small child and you get bitten by a snake, but your parents are there for you and they take care of you, they hug you, and everything as well. So if your foundation of safety has not been breached, the event might not be as traumatic for you. So that's why practicing community care is really important here. Okay, and then I wanted to also talk about historical trauma. So trauma is also not an individual experience, because we know that historically certain groups of people have been targeted. So groups have been targeted based on their racial, religious, or ethnic identities, and they may continue to experience intergenerational trauma as well after having experienced historical trauma. And intergenerational trauma refers to the trauma that gets transferred between generations. So for example, the Indian residential schools that were funded by the Canadian government have produced intergenerational trauma that's been passing on from generation to generation. And I just have one question for everyone. If you could post your answers in the chat. What are some examples of systemic inequities that create and sustain trauma? So thinking about how trauma is not an individual experience, what are some systemic inequities that create trauma? Microaggressions, yeah, for sure. Gender inequity, ableism, yeah, for sure. So the wider inequities, including racism, ableism, as was mentioned, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc., all of these inequities create trauma. Yeah, residential schools, which are connected to anti-Indigenous racism and genocide and the violence that Indigenous people continue to experience. Racism for sure. Yeah, great answers. Thank you, everyone. Welfare policies, yeah. Conversion therapy, definitely. Yeah, all great answers. Thank you, everyone. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and now I also wanted to define vicarious trauma because it's definitely relevant for scholar activist work. So vicarious trauma is an indirect type of trauma, and it occurs when we're exposed to difficult or disturbing images and stories secondhand. So we may be looking at different images, videos, reading different content as well online, and we might still experience vicarious trauma. And this is really important to talk about because as scholar activists, you might be engaging. You might be engaging with examples of oppression more closely, and we know that oppression traumatizes. So that's why I wanted to bring vicarious trauma up. And we can go to the next slide. So now I would just like to explain the different trauma responses. So what happens when someone experiences trauma and gets triggered. So we have four major responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So the fight response comes from an unconscious belief that maintaining power and control over others will lead to acceptance, safety, and love. The fight response can generate physical and verbal aggressive behavior. The flight response is when someone's running away from a situation. So wanting to escape or deny pain, emotional turmoil, and other distress. This doesn't just involve physically leaving a space. The flight response can also be, for example, if you are occupying yourself with work and overworking, and trying to avoid a certain trauma that you've dealt with. And then we have the freeze response, which is when someone is incapable of moving or making a choice. So it's like your brain presses the pause button in response to a certain overwhelming experience. So you might feel stuck. And then we have the fawn response, which is not often talked about, but this response is when you turn to people pleasing in an effort to keep yourself safe from harm. So basically you're trying to please a person to avoid any conflict. Someone who's having a fawn trauma response might also have difficulty saying no and putting up boundaries, and difficulty identifying their own feelings because they're prioritizing other people's feelings in order to keep themselves safe. So these are the various trauma responses that we have. The issue is that we tend to judge these different responses. So all of these responses are natural reactions that our body does to keep us safe in a certain situation. But socially, we tend to think that, for example, the fight response is the best and the freeze response is the worst. So we make judgments and have these hierarchies of which responses are better than others, when in reality, all of those responses are valid, and we ourselves don't even get to fully choose the response that we have because our brain makes the unconscious decision in the moment to keep us safe and to protect us. Okay, and we can go on to the next slide. I also wanted to touch on some holistic reactions to trauma, because we're using a holistic lens. So often it can be thought of as just a mental, someone's having just mental reactions, but I really want to talk about how trauma is an experience that impacts you as a whole being. So for mental reactions, someone could have reduced concentration and memory, could have flashbacks, confusion, intrusive thoughts about the event, repeatedly replaying parts of the event over and over in your mind. For some emotional reactions to trauma, people may experience fear, anxiety, panic, anger, shock, feeling numb, feeling guilt or shame, feeling grief, feeling exhausted, can also lead to depression, oversensitivity, withdrawal, so lots of different emotional reactions. In terms of the physical reactions, people experience fatigue, exhaustion, disturbed sleep, including nightmares, could experience nausea, could experience headaches, increased heart rate, or for the fawn response, the heart rate might slow down as well. So yeah, I'm just giving some examples, but a person doesn't have to experience all of these symptoms in order for us to say that they are having a trauma reaction. But I just wanted to give some examples to illustrate my point that we have holistic reactions to trauma. So talking about spiritual reactions, someone might feel like they're disconnected from others, might lose some meaning and purpose in life. In terms of behavioral reactions, someone might avoid reminders of the event, avoid triggers to keep themselves safe. Someone might become more vigilant. They might have changes in appetite, for example, such as eating more or eating less, might have sleeping problems. So yeah, there are various reactions, but there are no like perfect reactions or correct reactions to trauma, because the reactions that you're having is your body trying to keep you safe and keep you protected from an overwhelming experience. Now I can go on to the next slide. Okay. Could I introduce the activity first and then we'll stop the recording?
Yes.
Sorry, I just lost which slide we're on. Okay, so for the activity, I wanted us to watch a video about the window of tolerance. And then we'll discuss what the window of tolerance is, what is the optimal zone, what happens outside of the optimal zone, and what are some signs that we're outside of that zone. And also I wanted to talk about how trauma impacts our window of tolerance. Christina, would you mind sharing your screen and playing the video? And maybe before we do that, if you have any questions about all the information I just said, feel free to unmute yourself or post the questions in the chat.
This is the checkers game.
I think we can't hear the audio.
No. Christina, when you share, there's a checkbox to click for the audio.
Okay. 1 second. I'm just gonna pause it.
You probably have to stop it and start it again.
Okay.
If you select it, you'll see use computer audio or something as an option.
Okay.
The window of tolerance is a term used to talk about levels of alertness, what we can also call activation, that help people engage in their daily life. Every day, it's normal for all of us to move up and down in our levels of alertness. Maybe we watch our favorite sports team on TV and feel very engaged, and our level of alertness is pretty high. Then later on in the day, we curl up reading our favorite book, and our level of alertness is pretty low. It's really normal for people to move up and down throughout the day and to ebb and flow between feeling very alert and not as alert. We are able to move through these different states of alertness and manage them without much difficulty when we are feeling safe. This area is what we call someone's optimal zone. Here, people are able to balance and regulate the emotions coming up for them in ways that are calm, cool, collected, and connected. They are able to encounter stressing or difficult situations and manage their emotions. But what happens outside of our window of tolerance, outside of our optimal zone? This is something that we call dysregulation. Picture a window of tolerance, with our optimal zone being in the middle. We often talk about there being two different kinds of dysregulation. One, where we pop out of the top of our window, called hyperactivation, and one, where we drop out of the bottom, called hypoactivation. Hyperactivation is characterized by things like anxiety, overwhelming emotions, and accelerated thoughts and feelings. Sensations in our bodies that would tell us that we're here are things like increased heart rate, quickened breath, and maybe shaking or sweating. On the other end, hypoactivation is characterized by feelings of numbness or disconnect or lack of energy. Things can feel unreal, far away, or as if we've shut down. When we are in hypoactivation, our bodies experience a decrease in heart rate, slower breathing, and a general lack of physical sensation. Something to make note of is that dysregulation, both hyper and hypoactivation, make a lot of sense as responses to threats. It's what our brains and bodies do automatically to try to keep us safe in the face of real or perceived danger. So what exactly causes people to leave their windows of tolerance? Well, we know that a lot of different things can contribute to the increase or decrease in someone's level of activation. Danger is a primary reason. For example, a loud noise may increase someone's level of activation and send them to the top of their window. Or being in a crowd may make it difficult for some people to stay completely present in the moment, and their alertness may dip into the lower part of their windows. We also know that experiences of trauma can change the size of someone's window of tolerance. Traumatic experiences can reduce the size of someone's window, thus reducing the size of their optimal zone. As we talked about, this is where people can feel like they can manage their emotions in ways that are calm, cool, collected, and connected. Maybe things that used to be easy to handle, like a loud noise or large groups of people, don't feel as manageable anymore. So we know that our windows of tolerance can shrink as a result of traumatic experiences, and our optimal zones can become smaller. But there are also ways that we can grow and widen our windows as well. Learning to recognize the signs that we are outside of our window can be the first step in helping us stay in it. Then, practicing ways to intentionally manage our activation can bring us back into our windows when we find ourselves dysregulated. Most people benefit from guidance in this process, and you deserve support. And now we know a little bit more about the window of tolerance.
Okay, so that's an introduction to the window of tolerance. And I was hoping we can pause.
The window of
Okay, so this is a bit of a more detailed graphic that illustrates the window of tolerance, and it lists some of the signs that you're outside of the window of tolerance. So as I said, recognizing some of the signs could be one of the ways that you know that you're outside of this window of tolerance. And next I wanted to also have a discussion, so I'll pause the video again soon, about what are some practices that we can do when we are in hypoactivation to return to our window of tolerance. So when we when we're in hypoactivation, we're experiencing the flight response. We are more anxious. We're having increased heartbeat. What are some practices that we can do to calm ourselves down and to return back into our window of tolerance? And then the other question I wanted to talk about are what are some practices that we can do when we're in hypoactivation to return to our window of tolerance. So when we're in hypoactivation or the hypoarousal zone, we have little energy and we might be feeling numb, like not reacting as much to stimuli. We might be in the freeze trauma response. So I wanted to just brainstorm some practices that we could do to raise our energy levels and to return back to the window of tolerance. And we can pause the video. Okay, so now that we've learned a bit more about trauma and the window of tolerance and traumas linked to oppression, I wanted to have a bit of a discussion as well about why it's important to address trauma in scholar activist work. We can pause the recording again. Sorry, it's a bit of a back and forth. So this is just one other quote that I wanted to share that speaks to why it's important to name trauma in this work and be trauma aware. So the quote says, "This lens, meaning a trauma-informed lens, helps us understand why our students might be shut down or why a client is anxious and mistrustful. This lens asks us to assume that everyone is doing the best that they can in the moment and that most of our behavior is an attempt to regulate ourselves and feel safe and good." And this is a quote from Hala Kuri, who is a counselor. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay. So we're running a bit low on time, but with the little time that we have, I also wanted to talk about community care, because this is one way that we can address trauma in scholar activist work. Before we talk about community care, I want to define community care as empathetic actions that we take to support one another. And instead of having an individualizing lens that promotes self-care, community care asks us how we can support the people in our community and in return how we can receive support. So it's a reciprocal relationship. And we can go on to the next slide. And I was hoping we could have a bit of a discussion again, so we can pause the record. Okay, so I also wanted to introduce a healing justice lens. So this is a quote from an Indigenous climate activist that's talking about what healing justice is. So I think it's really important to practice in the context of community care, and basically healing justice is a framework that recognizes the impact of trauma and violence on individuals and communities and names collective processes that can help heal. And she also talks about how, quote, in the system and society that actively targets Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies with violence, oppression, and terror, it is critical to build movements that fight for and achieve justice for all people. And this justice includes healing, well-being, and not only surviving, but thriving. So I think this quote also illustrates why practicing community care is important and brings in another lens that we can consider when practicing community care. Now let's go on to the next slide. Okay, I think this is the discussion that I wanted to have. So we can pause the recording. We can go into the next slide. Okay, so these are some ideas that I brainstormed and also pulled based on my research and based on a workshop that the Sexual Assault Support Center did for the ORS team some time ago. So here are some trauma-informed community care practices we could do. Content warnings, as we talked about, active listening, grounding activities. They can be group grounding activities as well. Decompressing, like leaving space for rest, leaving space for flexibility, and building meaningful relationships, as we also talked about. And let's go on to the next slide. Here are some things that I thought we could denormalize. Inequities, because they sustain and they lead to trauma. Judgments and hierarchies. So as I talked about, we tend to think about a hierarchy of trauma responses, which is really not helpful. We can also think of a hierarchy of traumas. So for example, if someone has PTSD, that might be seen as more valid, while in reality, like all different traumas are valid. Another thing we could denormalize is like making someone prove their trauma to receive accommodations, which often happens in scholarly spaces. So resisting disclosure and proof can denormalize cultures of exhaustion and burnout that don't leave space for us to rest and take care of ourselves, and perfectionism. And the next slide. And here are some things we could normalize. I think a really important quote that I come back to is from Ashna Josh, who is the SASC manager. She talked about how you can't be trauma-informed without being anti-oppressive. So I think it's important for us to practice anti-oppressive, to do anti-oppressive practices, and also to develop trust, empathy, to promote whole body knowing, as we talked about, honoring choice, and creating accessible spaces. Let's go into the next slide. Okay, we're very over time, but I really like this quote. So I will read it out very quickly. So this quote is from Alicia Garza, who is the author of The Purpose of Power and the co-creator of Black Lives Matter. And I just wanted to leave the presentation with this quote. She says, "I'm not, and we are not defined by what we lack. We're defined by how we come together when we fall apart." Yeah, I find this quote very meaningful. Let's go into the next slide. Okay, and this is the list of resources. I will also paste it into the group chat. And you also have my slides on Slack if you want to check out any of the resources. Feel free to message me as well about the resources. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, we reached the end. We are a bit over time, so apologies. But if you're interested in learning more, you can go to my slides to see the references and also the further resources that I've included. But yeah, thank you for listening, everyone. And sorry for going over time.